The Galactic Empire had conquered thousands of worlds, its dominions stretching across the stars like an unbreakable chain. To them, humanity was little more than an insignificant species, barely advanced enough to be considered a galactic presence. Their planet, Earth, had remained outside the Empire's immediate concerns until the first human colonies began creeping into Imperial space. Even then, the Empire regarded them as pests rather than threats, creatures that could be pacified with minimal force. The colony of Horizon 4 was one such place, a quiet, self-sustaining settlement on the fringe of Imperial jurisdiction. It had no military value, no strategic positioning, only a few thousand humans trying to carve out a life among the stars. When the Empire's patrol ship, Ruthless, descended upon it, they did not come to wage war. It was supposed to be a simple enforcement of Imperial law, a warning to remind the colony of its place. But it only took a single act of arrogance to set fire to the stars. The child's name was Alan. He was 7 years old and had never known war. His mother had shielded him from that, kept him safe in the soft embrace of childhood while she handled humanity's darker struggles. He liked to chase fireflies in the artificial dusk of Horizon 4, his laughter carrying across the quiet fields. That night, he had wandered too far. The Ruthless' landing had been sudden, its engines roaring as it settled in the colony's central square. Alan had been drawn to the spectacle, his small frame slipping unnoticed between buildings. The Imperial soldiers disembarked with their usual air of superiority, clad in gleaming armor, their helmets hiding the disinterest in their eyes. They were not expecting resistance. They never did. Alan stood at the edge of the landing site, eyes wide, fascinated by the towering figures stepping onto his world. He had seen spaceships before, but never this close. One of the soldiers noticed him, a minor nuisance in an otherwise uneventful deployment. The boy shouldn't have been there. Orders were orders. A single raised blaster, a trigger pulled without thought. A child's body hitting the ground. The moment was brief, over in less than a breath. The soldiers barely acknowledged it. One of them nudged the small form with a boot before turning away. The colony would be given its warning, its leaders would kneel, and the Empire would move on. Except this time, they had made a mistake. News of Alan's death spread through the colony like wildfire, but it was not the grief of his neighbors or the anger of his friends that would shape the fate of the Empire. It was the message that traveled light years away, reaching the ears of a woman who had spent her life fighting monsters in the dark. General Cassandra Kael had many titles: war strategist, fleet commander, executioner of humanity's enemies. She had broken sieges, orchestrated battles that turned hopeless odds into victories, and built a reputation so fearsome that even the most hardened soldiers lowered their voices when speaking her name. But to one person, she had simply been Mom. The transmission came through in the dead of night. Cassandra was aboard the Erebus, her personal command ship, reviewing reports from the outer colonies. She had been expecting routine updates, supply shortages, minor conflicts. Instead, she received the only message that had ever made her hands tremble. She played the recording once, twice, 3 times, as if repetition could undo what she was hearing. The words felt foreign, as though they belonged to someone else's tragedy. Alan, gone, just like that. The officers aboard the Erebus did not hear their general scream. They did not hear the quiet, fractured sobs that followed, the sound of something breaking, something that had nothing to do with flesh or bone. What they did see, when she finally emerged from her chambers, was a woman who looked like she had crawled out of hell itself and was ready to drag the Empire in with her. Her orders came swiftly, each one a nail driven into the coffin of those responsible. She demanded every detail, every name. She studied the patrol ship's flight records, the ranks of the soldiers who had landed on Horizon 4, the faces of the men who had been there, the one who had pulled the trigger. They would all die. But this was not vengeance fueled by reckless grief. Cassandra Kael was no fool. She would not charge in a battle blinded by rage. If she was to burn the Empire for what they had done, she would do so methodically, with the same ruthless precision that had made her legend. She reached out to her contacts in the Human Defense Coalition, gathering intelligence, mobilizing assets. Humanity was not yet at open war with the Empire, but war had already begun in her heart. And soon, the Empire would realize what it had unleashed. The first to die would be the crew of the Veilus. Not quickly, not cleanly. Their deaths would serve a purpose, a message written in blood and fire. Cassandra's hands clenched into fists as she stared at the cold abyss of space beyond her viewport. Somewhere out there, the men who had killed her son still breathed, still existed as if their crime had been nothing more than an afterthought. That would change. By the time she was finished, the Empire would know what it meant to fear humanity. Cassandra Kael had waged war before, but never like this. This was not a battle for territory or resources. This was not a conflict dictated by politics or necessity. This was something purer, something raw and elemental. The Empire had taken her son, and now she would take everything from them. She moved with cold efficiency, suppressing the rage that burned beneath her skin. Emotion had its place, but it would not control her. Vengeance was not enough. Vengeance alone could be reckless, sloppy. What she required was annihilation, a war so calculated and devastating that the Empire would never recover from it. The Veilus was the first target. It had returned to its patrol route, its crew unaware that their fate had already been sealed. Cassandra had studied their movements, their docking schedules, their routines. They thought themselves untouchable. That illusion would break before they had time to understand what was happening. The attack came swift and silent. The Veilus never had the chance to call for help. A human strike team, handpicked by Cassandra, infiltrated the vessel with precision. Airlocks breached, alarms screamed, and before the crew could react, the corridors were painted red. The soldiers of the Empire, so used to unquestioned dominance, were unprepared for the brutality that met them. Cassandra was there herself, moving through the ship like a specter of death. The soldier who had pulled the trigger on Alan was found cowering in the barracks, his hands shaking as he reached for his weapon. He never made it. Cassandra buried a blade in his throat and watched the life drain from his eyes. It was not satisfaction she felt. It was nothing at all. When the last body fell, she left behind a message, a single line carved into the ship's steel walls. You killed a child. Now I will show you what humanity truly is. Then she set the Veilus adrift, its communication array shattered, its emergency beacon silenced. Let the Empire wonder what had become of their ship. Let them feel fear begin to creep into the edges of their certainty. The next phase of her war began immediately. She did not give the Empire time to react. She struck at their supply lines, cutting deep into their logistical arteries. Freighters vanished. Communications relays were destroyed. Naval depots burned. The Empire was massive, but it was also rigid, slow to adapt, bloated by its own complacency. Cassandra wielded that weakness like a blade. They responded, of course. Patrols increased, fleets mobilized, but they were chasing shadows. By the time they arrived at one attack site, she was already dismantling another. Each skirmish was a lesson, each engagement a step towards something greater. The Empire had never truly fought humans before. Not like this. They had mistaken humanity's patience for weakness, its diplomacy for submission. Now, they were learning the truth. But this was not just about destruction. Cassandra knew that war was not won by rage alone. It was won with strategy, with control, with the ability to see beyond the immediate battle. So she did not fight alone. She reached out to others, old allies, those who had once served under her command, those who had seen what the Empire was capable of and carried their own scars. The response was overwhelming. Humanity had lost much to the Empire's arrogance, but until now, they had held back, unwilling to ignite a war they were unsure they could win. Cassandra gave them something they had lacked. Not just leadership, not just a plan. She gave them the certainty that the Empire could bleed. The resistance grew in the shadows. It was no longer just soldiers and tacticians. It was engineers who could sabotage fuel lines, smugglers who could disrupt trade routes, scientists who could disable navigation systems. The Empire controlled 1,000 worlds, But Cassandra turned its own vastness into a weakness. The more ground they had to defend, the more vulnerable they became. Fear spread through the Empire's ranks. Soldiers whispered about the human general who fought like a force of nature, whose forces appeared from nowhere and left only ruin behind. They spoke of ships lost without distress calls, outposts abandoned in the dead of night, officers who vanished without a trace. But Cassandra was not satisfied. This was only the beginning. She stood aboard the Erebus, watching as intelligence reports flooded in. The Empire was beginning to take her seriously now. They had deployed an armada, vast and overwhelming, a force meant to crush any notion of rebellion before it could take root. It was a mistake, because Cassandra Kael did not fear their strength. She had spent her life fighting against impossible odds, and she had learned one undeniable truth. Strength without understanding was nothing. The Empire had power, but they did not understand humanity. They would learn. Her officers stood behind her, awaiting orders, their eyes sharp, their resolve unshaken. They had followed her into war before, but this time was different. This time, the battle was not for survival. It was for something far greater. Cassandra turned to them, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. "They think they can end this with brute force," she said. "They think they can break us the way they have broken 1,000 others. They are wrong. We are not fighting for conquest. We are not fighting for resources. We are fighting for something they will never understand." She let the words hang in the air, let them settle deep into the hearts of those who stood with her. "We are fighting because they killed a child, and for that, we will burn their empire to the ground." The order was given. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was time for the Empire to see what it had unleashed. The Imperial Armada arrived in force, its ships blotting out the stars like an artificial eclipse. They came with the confidence of those who had never known true fear, their formations perfect, their weapons primed. Cassandra Kael stood on the bridge of the Erebus, watching them through the reinforced viewport. A lesser commander might have seen an unstoppable force. She saw a brittle thing, fragile beneath the weight of its own arrogance. The Empire had always relied on overwhelming power, on the belief that no enemy could match them. They had never needed to be adaptable, had never learned how to fight an opponent who did not bend to their will. Cassandra had spent her life studying war, and she knew a fundamental truth the Empire had yet to learn. A superior force meant nothing if it did not understand the battlefield. And this battlefield was hers. The fleet she had assembled was not vast. It did not match the Empire's sheer numbers, nor did it need to. Humanity had never won wars through brute strength. They won through ingenuity, through defiance, through the refusal to accept defeat even when all odds were against them. Every ship at her command had been chosen for a purpose. Every movement had been planned with surgical precision. The battle had already been decided long before the first shot was fired. The Empire opened with a standard assault pattern, a broadside meant to crush opposition before it could react. It worked against lesser enemies, against those who panicked in the face of overwhelming force. Cassandra had counted on this. As their cannons thundered, her fleet was already in motion. Ships darted through gaps in the Imperial formation, slipping past the thickest fire zones like water through fractured stone. The Erebus led the charge, its shields flaring as it absorbed the first wave of impact. And then, the Empire's line broke. Sabotage teams had already infiltrated their supply ships. Explosions rippled through their formations as fuel lines ruptured, as navigational systems glitched, as their tightly coordinated fleet dissolved into chaos. Cassandra had not merely come to defeat them. She had come to dismantle them. The humans did not fight where the Empire expected them to. They did not follow predictable strategies. They struck from angles that made no sense, appeared where they should not be, disappeared before retaliation could land. She could hear the frantic Imperial transmissions, the panic creeping into their voices as they realized they were not facing an unruly rebellion. This was something else, something they had no name for. The Erebus weaved through the battlefield, its weapons carving through capital ships like a blade through soft flesh. Destroyers collapsed under precision strikes. Command ships drifted dark and silent, their crews lost before they could comprehend what had happened. Cassandra stood unmoving, her expression unreadable, her mind 5 steps ahead of every enemy movement. She saw the patterns before they formed, saw the desperate adjustments the Empire tried to make, the way they clung to their doctrine even as it crumbled around them. They were predictable. Predictability was fatal. It was over before the Empire realized they had lost. The remnants of their fleet attempted to retreat, but Cassandra had planned for that, too. Interdiction fields locked them in place, forcing them to face what remained of her fleet. Surrender came in broken voices, in fractured signals begging for ceasefire. She allowed no mercy. One ship was left intact. The command vessel, its hull scorched, its defenses shattered, floated helpless in the debris field. Cassandra ordered it boarded. The last of the Imperial officers had gathered there, awaiting whatever fate she would deliver. She entered their bridge alone. No weapons drawn, no armor beyond the standard uniform she had worn for decades. The Empire had always hidden behind power, behind symbols of dominance and control. She wanted them to see her as she was, not a conqueror, not a warlord, but a mother who had been robbed of the one thing she had sworn to protect. The admiral of the Imperial fleet stood at the center of the ruined command deck, his face pale, his once pristine uniform stained with smoke and blood. He was older, a man who had likely overseen dozens of campaigns, who had crushed countless worlds under his command. And yet, he had no words now, no threats, no demands. She did not ask if he remembered the name of the boy his soldiers had killed. He would not have. To him, Alan had been nothing more than a casualty, a nameless inconvenience in the machinery of conquest. That was why he had lost. That was why the Empire would fall, because they had never understood what it meant to take something irreparable. Cassandra did not prolong it. The admiral fell without ceremony, his body crumpling against the cold floor of his ship. The others who had stood beside him, who had issued orders that led to her son's death, followed soon after. She left one man alive, a lieutenant, young, trembling barely past his first command. She stepped close, watching him flinch as if expecting the same fate as his superiors. Instead, she spoke. "You will return to your emperor," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You will tell him what happened here. You will tell him that he has made a mistake he cannot undo. Tell him that every world he has taken, every life he has stolen, will be repaid in full." She leaned in, close enough that he could see the cold fire in her eyes. "And tell him that this was never about war." The young officer swallowed, his hands clenched at his sides. "This was about a mother," she said, "and you should have known better than to take her child." She turned and walked away, leaving him there amid the bodies of the fallen, the echoes of her words carving themselves into his memory. By the time Cassandra returned to the Erebus, the battlefield was already being cleared. The remnants of the Empire's fleet had been destroyed, their wreckage drifting through space like the bones of a dead beast. But this was not the end. This was only the beginning. She stood at the bridge, watching the stars beyond, knowing that word would spread. The Empire would not recover from this, not fully. They had thought themselves unchallengeable, untouchable. Now, they would feel the weight of fear, the way it crept into their thoughts, the way it made them hesitate before issuing orders of cruelty. War had not been her goal, but war was what they had earned. Cassandra Kael had lost the one thing that had ever truly mattered to her. There was nothing left for the Empire to take, and that meant there was nothing left to stop her.